maybe it's being a northern boy, but all the way through my career, like I've worked in big corporate organizations, I've worked in small businesses, worked for a time in the third sector, and a thread that goes through it all, regardless of where I've been, is just this almost like a frustration with how things can get really abstract in some ways. You know, we all spend some sort of time at work, and most people that I work with want to do stuff that matters, right? We want to do stuff that's meaningful. And that only ever happens once you climb down from sitting on a cloud and really get into the guts of, okay, so that's a great idea, but how are you going to implement it? Like, how does that actually take root in the real world? So I actually created a company back in, gosh, it was 2011, called Much Clearer. Believe it or not, I got the domain name. So I don't think you can get a single word in the English language now as a .com, but I own muchclearer.com. And the brand name for that business came about because at the time I was coming off the back of a career in corporate consultancy. So I've done a lot of stuff with Capgemini as a transformation consultant, working with blue chips and big government departments. Really, as a guy in his late 20s, going into environments that I didn't have much right to be in, to be fair, but that's the nature of big consultancy, is you get, chucked into, shark pools to sink or swim. And I did that for a while, but then came out of that, doing that big kind of corporate consultancy work, and set up Much Clearer as my gambit into, well, I want to really discover what my own thing was. And when I was creating the brand, it was one of my first clients said to me, oh, that's much clearer now. That always happens when you're around. And I kind of took that as a bit of a compliment. And I thought, well, I call the business that. So anyway, that relentless pursuit of clarity and taking, really good strategic ideas, or as we'll get onto, I'm sure, hypotheses and concepts that you want to test, but actually making it doable and achievable and implementing stuff. That's always tended to be the place that I play. Yeah. There's a real difference between strategy and planning. And I think people often confuse the two. Yeah. For me, strategy is creating a set of coherent hypotheses that you want to go and test, right? It's a suite of bets that you want to place on the market, right? Or if you're not a commercial organization, some bets that you want to place in your stakeholder sphere, or whatever it is, right? But it's not planning. It's not, as many people think, a set of goals or objectives or activities. That's not strategy. That's the planning that the strategy leads to. Yeah. And often, and I'm sure you guys get the same, right? When I try and facilitate clients through these kind of exercises, one of the first things we have to do is define terms, because terms can really trip people up and language can really trip people up. Yeah. And so we spend some time thinking about, okay, how do all of us think about strategy? Because I don't think about it as planning or objectives or goals. I think about it as coming up with a set of hypotheses. Yeah. And to use your words, my criteria for a hypothesis, yeah, is that it's a testable statement. Okay. It's not a question. It's a statement that you can go and test. And then your plan is, how am I going to go and test that statement? Yeah. So super simple example, right? So Co-op, big company that is in the UK that most of us have heard of and probably shopped from in the last month or so, right? So their strategy for the last few years in how they've gone about doing e-commerce, yeah, their strategy hasn't been the same as Asda and Tesco and the other big retailers that form, the big swathe of our grocery landscape. Their strategy has been, particularly around online, is to say, how can we fulfill, or it's based on a question of how can we fulfill what they call the smaller shopping missions of their customer. Yeah. And their hypothesis, when they were thinking about what their e-commerce offer looks like, is we can best serve our customers through fulfilling their smaller shopping missions with 2-hour delivery, right? So the Co-op is one of the only online food shops in the UK that you can get 2-hour delivery to your house, because they've adopted a completely different strategy to your Asda's and your Tesco's, where you can get delivery from a local store, of which there are thousands around the UK, but you're not going to get a full week or 2-week shop with the big van turning up. You're probably going to get a pizza and some milk and a few top-up bits, yeah? And they keep things quite small and quite fluid. But it came out of this strategy, which is like a testable statement, a hypothesis that they thought, right, we want to go and test that. And then the implementation of all of that got grounded when it was like, well, okay, what kind of technical infrastructure do we need for that? What kind of e-commerce platform? How do we need to gear up like our in-store apparatus with our colleagues and the picking and all of that stuff? All of the practical things comes out of a testable hypothesis, which is something like, we think we can best serve our customers through fulfilling the shorter shopping missions. Yeah? And for me, it's that criteria, the criteria around having a testable statement. What's the gamble that you want to place in your marketplace?
It's quite a stringent criteria to pass, because I guess it's very easy. Lazy brain, chimp brain probably wants to come up with something that isn't a testable strategy, because with a testable anything hypothesis, you can fail to meet it when you test it, I guess. So that actually is raising the bar a little bit.
No, 100%. And I think, oh gosh, who's the author of the book? It's probably on Bryce's shelf behind us. It's a phenomenal book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. I think it's Rummelt. Yeah, of course it is. So
he says that because we can't see the bookcase.
Just a general point.
None of them are actually there, but he just says they are to make us feel better.
Without a doubt. I don't think you've got a strategy unless you have that, right? Because in that book that Bryce is going to find for us, I think it's Rummelt.
Rummelt. It is Rummelt. It's got a black and white. It's got a black and white cover.
One of the things that I find really good about that book, like there's a lot in there and it's very dense, and I don't follow it as a holistic, this is how I do strategy, but there's some really good stuff in there. And one of the things is that he actually says, it's really good to kind of think about what good strategy is by first of all looking at what bad strategy is. And I think he comes up with three things that are, there you go, good strategy, bad strategy. Well done, Bryce. Bad strategy, I can't remember all three, but the two really stick out at the top. The two first ones are, bad strategies are often fluffy. So these are the generic mission statements that we see on, the About Us page of so many companies' websites, or the vague, ambiguous, we're going to, increase our market share by exceeding our customers' expectations. That is not a strategy, that's fluff, But that's the essence of what so many businesses have as their strategies. So that's bad strategy. But the second bad strategy is almost the polar opposite of that, which is really concrete objectives. We will increase our ROI on this CapEx investment by the end of 2022. That sounds like it's a good strategy, but it's not. It's a really concrete objective that doesn't allow for the exploration that strategy demands. So I think in practical terms, when you're working with clients or when you're doing your own strategy work in-house, you do need to spend some time thinking about, well, first of all, what do we define as good strategy, bad strategy? What are we trying to go for? What kind of statements do we think represents a 10 out of 10 in terms of, yes, that is shaped as a good strategy? And then it does take some iteration. I think if you rush into it and try and do it too quickly, you'll end up with what chimp brain or lazy brain leads you to, which is probably a really vanilla list of goals, which nobody really buys into or believes, but it's what we can most quickly get to because we're used to doing it all the time. Or you just settle for some vague, fluffy, kind of generic nonsense, which, to be honest, most of your competitors have. And I think it does take some iteration to come up with, a decent, testable hypothesis, which actually takes a bit of intellectual effort, but it is worth it because, go on, Bryce.
Interesting example, but very basic. So it goes like this. How can we clean the floor of this hospital ward so that any test doesn't pick up E. coli or salmonella?
Yeah, I love that. I would just rephrase that so it wasn't a question. I would say our hypothesis is that we can clean the floor of this hospital such that E. coli can't be picked up. Yeah, exactly, because what you've then got to do is then go away and design some experiments. So what are the experiments we're going to pursue to test that hypothesis to see if the strategy is working? So those efforts, those solutions that you started to articulate there, I think what they become is a suite of experiments that begin to build your plan, right? So we're going to have a 2-month pilot, which will be, in that wing of the hospital, we're going to spray the floors. But in that wing of the hospital, because we want to do a control, we're going to steam the floors. Yeah? And you put that into your plan, and so that then becomes the concrete thing that you go away and implement. Yeah. But as the leader of that business or that organization, you're interested in what's the learning that this strategy has, 2 months into being implemented. What's the learning that's created and that's generated, and how much further are we in our understanding of how we can deliver against that strategy? Have we found that we've got equal results from both of those wings of the hospital? As one method being better than the other? Okay, great. Now that we've got that learning, now we know what really needs to be our growth plan or our big plan or the big project that we fund. You get to the end of that 2-month experiment and you find out that by spraying the floor, it was great, but actually you had the unintended consequence of a lot of people slipping. Yeah, so that's actually cost you a lot, right? Whereas if you steam the floor, it dries much quicker and it's equally as effective. Okay, great. You know what? Now we're going to buy, £500,000 worth of steamers and roll those out across the trust and all the rest of it. You see, you don't predefine your solution. And that's why bad strategy is just a list of goals or activities. Yeah. Good strategy starts with, okay, what's the thing that we're trying to test? You shape a couple of experiments, and then you have the results of those experiments come back into the plan and say, they're the things that you really want to do at scale. The arena that I play in most is around like tech and creative companies. And there's a phrase that's kind of becoming mainstream that's borrowed from the Agile toolkit, which is retrospective. I think it's becoming a lot more common for teams, regardless of if you're in a tech business or a creative company. I hear about, teams, to stick with the NHS, like, my next door neighbor works in the NHS. And we were chatting across the fence the other day and she said, oh yeah, well, when we do our retrospective, I'm like, you guys do retrospectives, you're in healthcare. But basically what she means is once a month, her team sits down and does exactly what you've just said. Yeah. And I think that discipline that not just Agile's given us, but it's just common sense, right? It's leaking from lots of different parts of management practice. But having the discipline to stop, draw breath, think, and go, what is the last month? What is the last project? What is the last year taught us? And then how can we recycle that back into our organization? Because that's the real nub of it. It's all very well to have a nice away day where you sit down, drink coffee, stick post-it notes on the wall. But can you take that learning and do something with it? That's the value in a retrospective or in some kind of, lessons learned out of any kind of strategy. But really, that's where the value is. So I think that's the big challenge, actually. It's one of how can you make sure you take the time and install the disciplines to extract learning from what you do. But then, the best of the best find creative ways to recycle that learning and to do something. Like I'm not into football, nowhere near as much as Mart is. Yeah. But I am riding the wave as a Liverpool boy of the glory of the last couple of years from Herr Klopp and all the stuff that he's done at Liverpool. Now, one of the really interesting things if you dig into some podcasts and some interviews that he's done, one of the things he's done in the culture, you mentioned culture, Bryce, one of the things he's done in the culture of Liverpool, specifically since he's joined, is he's got these 4 pillars. He's got these 4 things that are part of how he leads the club. And one of them is called psychological safety. It's very explicit. I think he nicked it from some guys at Barcelona, but it's a very explicit principle as to how he leads the club to make it psychologically safe for people to fail. Like, he doesn't lead in the same way as Alex Ferguson, which was largely through fear, dominance. Fair play, they did amazing things and there's no right or wrong, it's just different styles. But isn't it interesting that one of the things that we're seeing recently, like in Klopp, is to say, how can I create a culture of psychological safety where people don't get blamed if things go wrong, that we allow ourselves, the freedom to experiment and play, and fail is part of that. And we do these lessons learned exercises where it's always constructive, and it isn't just about doing down the person that got it wrong, but it's about taking it into, okay, how do we win more games in future, right? And there's a classic one, I forget which game it was, but goalkeeper made a horrendous error and ended up costing the game. And then there was articles written about it afterwards about how, like, in any other team, that goalkeeper would have been benched, he'd have been punished, he'd have been, not selected for play. But actually, that wasn't what happened on the club. It was like a quick chat, feed into the next training cycle, and then crack on. I think that was in the 2018-19 season, and then the next season we end up and going with the treble. So, yeah, not a football guy, but just saying, it's interesting.
it's making almost a science of strategy in the way that it's bringing some of these things in, and therefore the connection I've made is, in order to do that, you need somewhere a reliable way of gathering evidence and data and things. And I was testing myself earlier, and I was trying to be clever enough to come up with a testable hypothesis for big picture. And I think I tried a little bit, but then I got distracted by the fact that we have a parallel path on the laws of engagement, which defines some formula around engagement, collaboration, and outcomes. And I was making that link. There's a need for me to take those rather vague top-down percentages around engagement that CIPD offer and actually turn them into a more empirical approach to gathering, even if there is remaining some subjectivity in it, because that's there. And I was making that scientific link. So that's what you've said makes sense, because I don't know how good we are at measuring some stuff as an experiment, because we're not in a lab. We're not dealing with chemical elements. We're not dealing with measuring things. We are working with people. So where I'm scratching away at is, if we have laws of motion and laws of thermodynamics, what are the laws of engagement? And does that talk to your point about the need to be more scientific with our strategy work?
Well, okay, man, there's a lot in there. Well, let me say this. Let me start with this. I think as we're getting better, and when I say we, I mean every organization I work with is increasingly getting better at using and harnessing its data, right? Just because technology in the cloud has done so much for us in opening up what used to live in on-premise servers or inside spreadsheets or on people's hard drives. So there is a rising expectation and confidence in our ability to measure stuff, right? However, what we shouldn't do is, and what I see actually quite a lot, I'm sure you guys see the same, right, is just because you can do it a little bit, suddenly you idolize it and you think everything's got to be super measurable and we should have a KPI for this and a measure for that, and if you can't track it, it doesn't exist, and use all of that kind of language. I personally don't go that far, and I don't think it's helpful or practical. Yeah, and again, as a good Northern boy, I'm all about it being practical, right? And particularly for most of the companies that, you know, if you're not Barclays or if you're not Coke and you haven't got unlimited funds to invest in data scientists and, you know, big data programs inside your organization, like gathering data is hard and it's expensive. Okay. So I try and take a middle road in making it, you know, you said scientific, right? I think be as scientific as your organization can be, or stretch yourself a little bit in terms of, right, well, we don't currently measure that, but we could put a measure in place if we did X, Y, and Z and it didn't cost us all that much. Okay. But having it, because there are lots of other ways to measure things, right? Other than just a number on a graph. Yeah. You can, if you want to, you can do surveys. You could just do empirical, did this work or not? Yes, no. You know, how do we feel about that red, amber, green, and use the subjective opinion of experts in your business? You know, I think all of those are valid types of measurement. And again, I think we need to be nuanced and sophisticated in how we think about measurements. And that doesn't always mean we need to get a sophisticated data-driven measurement. If you've got it, brilliant. But if you don't have the specific data that's automatically coming at you in a daily report, then fine. It's probably going to cost you like millions to get that set up. So in absence of that, don't stop moving just because you can't measure it. Yeah, find different, less precise but still credible. It's something I talk a lot to my clients about. You know, you're not aiming for precise, you're aiming for credible and confident. You know, find a way of measuring and gauging how successful your hypotheses are. And data is one input to that, but it doesn't have to be the entirety of the input to that. But I mean, one of the reasons that we get on is not just because we like to wear the same colors, but
good.
I'm wearing the same glasses and I've got similar haircuts. I mean, you've been copying me for years, right? I know. No, I think one of the reasons we get on is because we've always, ever since we first met, I think, gosh, it was probably about 10 years ago, wasn't it? This, you talk a lot, and probably a lot more than me, about the laws of engagement. I think engagement in change Well, if you're not, well, think about it from a purely literal perspective. If you're not engaging with something, you can't change it. Yeah. If you're not touching something, if you're not engaging with something somehow, you're by definition, you're just observing it. Yeah. But you can't impact that thing. So change goes hand in hand with engagement, right? And you and I both know there's so many different frameworks and tools and methods and means and all the rest of it. And we, as you know, consultants, you're trained to death in all of the different academic models, you know, Kotter's 8 steps, Porter's this, you know, all the books that are behind Brace. I've got great ideas. Essentially, I think they all come back to similar principles and ideas, though, which is, you know, how do you create a sense of urgency? Like that something needs to shift. How can you help people feel that urgency, yeah, and absorb something of what it means for them, whether they've got a role to play or how they're going to be impacted by it, yeah? How can you mobilize like people's efforts and momentum towards the change, yeah? And then how can you kind of, you know, I mean, gosh, what was it? Cotter used the first one that talked about, you know, low-hanging fruit or short-term wins. But I think we've moved on from that. But it is, how can you give people a sense of progress? Because you can talk a good game, but unless you're finding, you know, those low-hanging fruit, those short-term wins, even though I don't use that language anymore, but unless you're helping people feel like there's a sense of progress, tangible progress towards this thing that you're trying to, you know, create, this change you're trying to affect, then by definition, people feel that things are stagnant. So, and then you've just got to wash, rinse, repeat that process and model. Yeah? Now, there's loads of ways to do that. You know, I'm a big fan of workshops, and even in the, you know, the COVID era of everything going online, you know, we've done tons and tons of online workshops just by flipping things into, you know, cloud-based tools. Everyone's getting dead familiar with Zoom, but not just having Zoom meetings where you sat there talking, but using virtual whiteboarding software like Miro and Mural are probably the big ones at the minute. But even just getting stuff around Google Docs, you know, so a lot of teams just all collaborate on documents live in the cloud. Look, 10, 15 years ago, the three of us couldn't have been doing that. You know, if this would have happened 10, 15 years ago, we'd have been goosed. Yeah, we'd have been on the phone to each other, like trying to describe to each other what we were thinking. Now we can see it on our PCs in real time. Yeah? So engaging people, using the tools that we've got, but doing it in such a way where you're helping them feel progress towards this big change that you're trying to affect. There's loads of tools and frameworks that you can use, but the essentials of engagement and progress, I think, are what I keep coming back to. How do we engage people and how do we help show progress?
Two of the variables I would pull in there are, one is, by using these tools, people are active and they're making and doing, and they're actually practicing and experiencing rather than being told. And I think what has happened over the last few months, that's been kind of accelerated and brought to the fore, that you can't, I know there are still some people out there doing show and tell. And if there's one thing, and people are going to know I'm talking about in my network, it won't, but I'm not going to mention any names. If I go on a session and the cameras and the mics are off, and it is that moderated question and answer session, I'm pretty much out now. I pretty much disappear. I either disappear intellectually or I disappear physically off the session. And if anyone out there knows who I'm talking about, that's absolutely fine. I'll talk to them about it afterwards. The other thing I'm talking about is having masks, or having physical contact with materials. So I'm surrounded by materials here. Yeah. And I think this is one of the things that we are almost getting towards with putting stuff in collaborative boards. Do we still need the physical element on our desk of interacting with physical props? Like Bryce already on this call has turned around to his bookcase. That's where his mass of knowledge is. Before we recorded, Sean, you were showing us your plants and the things that surround you with. You can see I'm within a scene full of mass. I think we need mass in our experience, and I think that's something I'm thinking very much about. And I think to have mass, you've got to be able to traverse from the digital into the physical and back again. I agree. I don't know there's a lot of people doing that. And I think that is a massive differentiator. In order to do that, the mass needs to be straightforward and simple enough for you to be able to traverse from one to another. For instance, having straightforward symbols that people can recognize in both media. Once you wrap it up in PowerPoint or something like that, you can't get access to it. So I think it's a direction of travel I've spotted, and I just wanted to air that with you to see if that resonates.
Yeah, a million percent. I think we are, I mean, we're sacks of meat at the end of the day, aren't we? We're clever sacks of meat, but that's effectively what we still are. And we experience the world through all our senses. Touch is a massive part of it. Yeah. And, you know, we did a huge, well, it's huge for us, big digital workshop a few months ago, where we had 110 people all on this call from 16 businesses. All 16 businesses were working on their own growth strategies. And we had digital breakout rooms, and they were all in different places. So they all had to, you know, share their screens in their own little hubs. It was a really complex affair. But one of the things that we did, and it took us a long time and it cost us a decent amount of money, but we thought it was worth it, was we got every single person's address and we sent them in the post, like a little kit. And it was our quick and dirty attempt at trying to embrace a little bit of what you were talking about. And we did it, and you know, it wasn't much. It was like a bit of a workshop guide. It was, we sent them a little bit of chocolate. There was a nice pen in there. There was a good notebook. Probably spent about like maybe 30 quid per person. Yeah. And some of the materials were to be used in the session. And I think that was our like first initial attempt at going, how can we try and bridge this horrible divide that we're now in, where everything is pixelated? Yeah, like how can we get past that? And it was probably quite a crude way of doing it, but you know, what did most people talk about in the feedback? Of course, they talked about the thing that arrived on their doorstep. You know, yes, they loved the digital process that we led them through. Yes, it was quite, you know, cool that, you know, all 16 businesses were together and then they were separate and then they came back together. You know, riding that wave was pretty interesting. But what mattered most to them was the physical thing that they could interact with, right? And I think the smart businesses of the future are going to find very powerful ways to do that. Because if we are going to be really distributed and working from home and all in different locations, I don't think we can just rely on talking to each other through screens to feel, and that's the operative word, feel connected. And one way of kind of augmenting that sense is through physical assets. Yeah, if you can get people to physically touch similar things that they know the other person is touching, then you've got a psychological connection there that you don't if you're just looking at them through a screen like this.
Yeah, and do you think that's more applicable to the setting of strategy and the testable hypothesis with experiments, or more to do the planning and execution? Because that's what I'm going to take away from this, is how can that mass play a role in both? Because if we acknowledge that separation from earlier, and a consistent thread is the use of mass and physical materials, then can that work both in the strategy setting, the testable hypothesis? Because if it can, I would imagine that's where it's harder to do it rather than the planning and implementation, because I think planning and implementation suggests more physical, tangible, more concrete, things. So I'm now thinking, how can we bring that into the testable hypothesis setting? It's almost going to be maybe through metaphor or through something that isn't directly related. But if it's like that for this, then how could it be for the hypothesis that we're looking at?
Yeah, you see, you're a clever fellow, aren't you? Because my brain was going to a similar place around metaphor. Yeah, one of the exercises that I do sometimes in workshops is when we're trying to horrible word of ideation, and using innovative means to ideate, right? And often you'll give people physical prompts to spark that ideation. And it could be to set up a theme, right? So you might be saying, how can we solve this particular supply chain problem? You know, I've given people toy animals before, and while they're playing with the toy animals, it's like, well, how would you solve that problem if you were a lion? Yeah, or how would you solve it? How is that problem solved in nature? Yeah, or you give people little toy soldiers to play with, and it's like, what would that look like in a military context? Yeah, and so having physical prompts to move people's brains into a different sphere, and maybe to come up with metaphors which you then bring back, is often a really important stage when you're doing like pretty decent strategy work. It's also when you're building new products. There's a guy who I actually partner with sometimes who's actually much better at this than I am. And very quick story, he helped a team in the prison service think about how they could safely administer drugs to prisoners in a really innovative way. And it was all around, because they started with the question of, and this is why questions are bad, right? Because questions lead you directly to a solution. But they started with the question of, how can nurses administer drugs to prisoners more safely? And my mate, Jay, his name is, Jay pulled the group back and said, don't ask the question like that. Have a statement, which is, prisoners can take drugs in a safer way than currently. Yeah, that's our hypothesis. Now let's test that. And he got them to think about superheroes, right? And he gave them some daft superhero cards. And one of the superheroes was Energy Man. And this sounds stupid and ridiculous, but stick with me. One of the participants was like, how would I, as Energy Man, solve that problem? And they came up with this stupid idea around, well, I'd probably create a force field around the prisoner and their drug was inside it. Yeah, but they could only come out once the drug tested that they had actually ingested it. Yeah, and it'd all be around energy and stuff. And they played it back and everyone laughed and that. But another person at the end of the table said, we could do that. So like we could set up a secure safe zone, yeah, where a prisoner comes in one side and there's like an Amazon style locker in there that would give them a code for. They press that, they self-administer the drug, and then we've got bioscanners, which we're testing at the minute, where if they prick the finger, it'll give an instant blood test that yes, that drug is in their system. And then they could get released out of a different door. Nurse never has to get involved, right? Yeah. Isn't that such a cool, and that's being piloted now, right? And I think those creative ways of helping people think in different realms and then doing the transportation back into, so, okay, what does that look like in real life? I think A, that's necessary, and B, it's helped with physical prompts.
An observation that often by the time the strategy gets out to the wider team, some of those incorrect assumptions have already been integrated into whatever the forming strategy is. So I would prefer, my preference is to engage with the wider team before those assumptions have already been laid down and actually describe and position it as something together. We're going to put forward a testable hypothesis that we've all got a chance to actually input in, and the best way to engage with the wider team is use maths or is use some form of physical props to engage. So you're setting the parameters in different ways. The key parameter is you want to achieve a testable hypothesis. The way we're going to do that is not just through a pixelated screen, as you call it. We're actually going to do that by some parameter which allows people the creativity to go at it, because I do think colleagues and wider team have got these ideas, but as you've described with your colleague Jay there, if they're asked the wrong question, they'll start to give the answers that they expect, and once it becomes a question and answer transaction, people then start answering what they think they want to hear. So maybe it's the formation of strategy. The lesson I'm taking away from this, Sean, from you, the insight, is that it's a hypothesis-based structure with some experiment and data gather, and it's entirely right to open up that formation of hypothesis with the wider team, maybe using some maths.
The question you ask at the beginning is absolutely crucial because we often start at the wrong place. The most effective change program probably ever in history was an American team that went into Southeast Asia and eliminated child malnutrition in the space of about 18 months. And the way they did it was they went in and they said, okay, malnutrition's prevalent, but what about the people who haven't got malnutrition? What's their story? And they discovered that those mothers collected shrimps and prawns from the rice paddies, and they cooked it and they gave the kids that protein, which did away with pellagra and beriberi and so on. They then got those mothers to go around and talk to other mothers. They didn't do an American program where they issued manuals and brochures and videos and so on. They got those mothers to meet with other mothers. In 18 months, they eliminated malnutrition in that country, totally.
If we're going to come up with a testable hypothesis, we really should give everybody a chance, just in case they've got a way of flipping it around, as in Bryce's in your story, because sometimes the top of the shop are like all of us. They're so close to it.
100%.
Once you predetermine what you think the answer is going to be, I think one of the worst things I've seen is like line 88 of an old Gantt chart saying, tell the team what we do, or engage the team. It was engage the team. You know, the work was done. Again, I'm not naming any consultancies, but I will later. The line 88 was, we've done all the clever stuff at the top of the shop. Let's tell the team, let's engage the team. So it's very much combining those things. So when we edit and do the outputs for this, what's important is testable hypothesis, collect the evidence, but include the team in that. And if it includes mass or experience or practice rather than theory, no mass and no evidence, then always go with the former rather than the latter. And that's what I've taken away from the chat.